Welcome to The Explainer. So today we're going to completely flip a script that almost all of us have in our heads. When you picture ancient human life, you probably imagine this constant, grueling, desperate struggle just to survive the day, right? You know, dodging predators, endlessly foraging for berries, fighting the freezing elements from dawn until dusk. But what if I told you that our prehistoric ancestors actually had way more free time than we do? We're going to dive right into exactly what ancient humans did when they got bored, and how that very boredom actually sparked the birth of human culture. Okay, let's get into it.
90,000, just let that number sink in for a second. It is a staggering figure, and it represents the average number of hours modern humans spend working over their lifetimes. That's roughly 1/3 of your entire waking existence, totally dedicated to a job, to schedules, to blaring alarms, and endless to-do lists. And you know, we usually consider this the absolute pinnacle of human progress, the necessary price of living in a highly advanced society.
But the contrast here is what's truly mind-blowing. When anthropologists studied modern hunter-gatherer groups who live really similarly to our prehistoric ancestors, like the Juhansi in Botswana, they found something totally unexpected. The adults in these groups spent only about 15 to 20 hours a week actually acquiring food. The rest of their time, they were completely free. I mean, you probably work twice that amount of time just sitting at a desk. So the absolutely crucial takeaway here is that for 99% of human history, the concept of employment simply didn't exist.
Section 1. The Myth of Ancient Work.
Now, you might be wondering, come on, how do we actually know prehistoric humans had it so easy? Well, the answer is literally buried in their bones. When archaeologists compare the skeletons of early agricultural farmers to the much older hunter-gatherers, the shift is dramatic. The farmers, who supposedly lived in this more advanced stage of society, actually had shorter stature, massive tooth decay from grain-heavy diets, and spinal arthritis from repetitive, grueling labor. Meanwhile, the older, ancient hunter-gatherers, they were taller, healthier, had way better teeth, and showed far less joint damage. They were simply doing less physical labor. They had vast amounts of leisure time.
Section 2. The Evolutionary Purpose of Boredom.
So if survival only took a couple of hours a day, didn't ancient humans get incredibly bored?
Well, yeah. We tend to think of boredom as this modern annoyance, right? Something we try to cure by endlessly scrolling on our phones. But as the scientific literature on the psychology of boredom reveals, it's actually a vital evolutionary tool. Boredom is essentially a defense mechanism. It punishes behavior that lacks meaning, so we don't waste precious energy on monotonous tasks. And instead, it pushes the organism, in this case early humans, to explore, to learn, and to innovate. It's a literal evolutionary catalyst. Honestly, without boredom, humanity never would have advanced.
Section 3. Prehistoric Toys and Doodles.
And we actually have the physical, archaeological evidence showing exactly how this evolutionary boredom played out in real life. For millions of years, humans and our early ancestors used their free time to create things that had absolutely zero practical survival benefit. I mean, 40,000 years ago in Germany, they were carving bone flutes just to make music. 100,000 years ago, they were making shell bead jewelry, which meant they were literally walking miles just to collect shells to drill tiny holes in them. 500,000 years ago, they were engraving shells. And going way, way back, a massive 2 million years ago, they were making stone toys.
Let's zoom in on that 2 million year mark for a second. Over in the Nihewan Basin in China, researchers discovered what they genuinely believe is an ancient playground. Sitting by a massive lake, where herbivores roamed and the environment felt safe, ancient mothers and children just hung out together. In an area less than 6 square meters, archaeologists found 700 incredibly tiny stone artifacts. They were way, way too small to be hunting tools. They were carved simply to pass the time, likely by women and kids just enjoying a sunny afternoon.
Paleoanthropologist Wei Qi actually studied these tiny stones, and he made this really beautiful observation. He said, "You can almost feel the maker's love and passion which was deeply embedded in this piece." Just imagine that. 2 million years ago, a mother sat by a lake, maybe a little bored but totally content, and painstakingly carved a tiny little stone toy for her child. That is the incredible power of prehistoric free time.
And we see another amazing example of this in a museum collection from Trinale, Java. Researchers found a 500,000-year-old freshwater shell with a geometric zigzag pattern deliberately carved right into it by Homo erectus. It wasn't a map, it wasn't a tool, it was a doodle. A 500,000-year-old doodle. The precision shows some serious dexterity, for sure. But more importantly, it shows an early human just passing the time by making cool patterns.
Section 4. Firelight, Laughter, and Stories.
Now, our ancestors' downtime shifted fundamentally once they mastered fire, because suddenly they safely added 2 to 4 usable hours of light to the end of every single day. Before fire, when the sun went down, you basically hid in the pitch black and just tried really hard not to get eaten. But a campfire? That created a glowing 30-foot circle of absolute safety. So what did they do with those extra hours? Well, anthropologist Polly Weissner found that while daytime talk was super practical, hunting logistics, gathering food, at night, an overwhelming 81% of their conversation shifted to stories, myths, and jokes. The campfire was essentially the original movie theater. It was the exact place where human culture, imagination, and shared history were born.
And surrounding all those campfire stories was laughter. The science behind why we laugh is absolutely fascinating. As human populations grew, physically picking bugs out of each other's hair, which is traditional primate grooming, just took way too much time. So evolutionary scientists actually believe laughter evolved as a form of virtual grooming. It allowed early humans sitting around that fire to efficiently maintain complex social bonds with a bunch of people all at once. Laughter literally held their societies together.
But the night didn't end when the story stopped. Even the way they slept was totally different from us. Before artificial light, humans naturally followed a biphasic sleep cycle. Basically, they'd go to sleep shortly after sunset for about 4 hours. Then, they would wake up in the pitch black for an hour or two, a period historians called the watch. And finally, they'd go back down for a second sleep until dawn.
Now, during this midnight watch, they weren't frantically tossing and turning with what we'd call insomnia today. Not at all. Sleep studies that replicate ancient lighting conditions actually show that during this middle-of-the-night waking period, the human brain produces elevated levels of prolactin. This induces a highly distinct, peaceful, meditative state of consciousness that's just perfectly meant for deep reflection. Our ancestors used this incredibly quiet time to think, interpret their dreams, and really just exist peacefully in the dark.
Section 5. The Trap of Modernity.
So, if our ancestors had all of this abundant leisure time, the art, the storytelling, the peaceful meditative rest, what on earth happened to us? Well, the world radically changed roughly 10,000 years ago with the agricultural revolution. And it was an enormous trade-off. We basically traded ultimate freedom and leisure time for constant labor and food security. See, farming allowed us to feed far more people, which led to massive population growth, but it locked humanity into an endless cycle of grueling labor. Once those populations exploded, there was no going back to the 15-hour workweek of hunting and gathering. We were effectively trapped by our own success.
And the cost of this progress was steep. Population explosions required specialists, which eventually led to the actual invention of employment. Suddenly, your time belonged to someone else in exchange for resources. Jump ahead a few centuries, and the invention of artificial light completely wiped out our natural biphasic sleep cycle and that beautiful meditative midnight watch. We ended up with the modern 9-to-5 grind, the blaring alarms, the rigid schedules, and this constant, heavy pressure to be productive every single waking moment.
It really leaves us with a provocative thought. We spend 90,000 hours of our lives working, often just dreaming of the day we can finally retire, relax, and actually pursue our hobbies. But if our ancient ancestors, the very people we so often view as primitive, already possess the endless leisure time, the deep social bonds, and the artistic freedom that we spend our entire lives trying to earn, what exactly are we working so hard for? Thank you so much for exploring this with me today. Keep asking questions, keep learning, and hey, maybe allow yourself a little time today to just be bored.